Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from. I hope you enjoyed a little bit of Bodyguard from Beyonce's greatest masterpiece, Cowboy Carter. Good morning again. My name is Richard Aviles. I am with the Othering and Belonging Institute. Thank you for joining us to our second installment of the Reimagining Urban Planning for Belonging web series. Thank you all again for those who came to our first one. We had over 900 of you all come to our first session, which is something we did not foresee. And if anything, I think it was just a manifestation of the hunger for what is needed. And to give you a little bit of an intro of what this series is, it's completely, very openly, and very honestly a critique to the current iteration of urban planning. I personally believe, and I think 900 of you all who came last month and the 200 that are here today, that the current iteration of urban planning is just not working. And so basically, I come from a background in urban planning and social work, and I'm also an artist. So today's session feels very, very much at home. It feels like I'm feeling like a little bit of an Oprah. I'm glad that we have the speakers that we have today, and I'm very excited. Um, and a couple of things again. So we are basically just talking about good morning. I see folks from Puerto Rico. I saw Northern Arkansas. So I'm glad you are all here. And again, so we're just looking at the ways in which urban planning has been taught to us who have gone through formal training in urban planning, but also for folks who are interested in what urban planning even is, and really trying to understand how it's been taught, its critiques and its flaws, and thinking about how we can also move forward and bring about a different iteration. There are a couple of exciting things. I'll announce this so far, but because of the 900 people who came last month, we decided to create a Discord. A Discord is an online server that I'll share the link by the end of the session, where we're filling it in as we go, but it's an opportunity for people to continue to network, for people to ask questions, to get access to all of the reading materials that we are using. And these are just reading materials that I've been reading and just sort of formulating thoughts. And it's going to be available to all of you all. So I'll share that link by the end of the session. And today we have three speakers, which I'm excited. We have three speakers who will be joining us. I will start off by doing what's called an introductory descent. And it's just basically, again, some of the things that I've been going through my mind in partnership with some of the team at OPI, and just kind of what we're thinking about in each of the different topics. Again, today is arts and cultural strategy. Next month is also an exciting month. It's embodiment in urban planning. So we're going to talk about the body and the role of the body in urban planning. So I'm excited for that. After, we'll hear about 10 minutes from each of our speakers. And then after we hear from them, we'll come back and have an all group discussion. And then that's an opportunity for you also to share some of your questions. Feel free to continue to share your questions in the chat as they come through, because we'll be taking notes and then jotting them down and then sending them over to the speakers. And we'll try to do an FAQ, and that'll be on the Discord. That being said, I don't know, I can't see all of y'all, but are we ready to go? Let's get into it. Let's dive into this. And so again, this session is around arts and cultural strategy. And I think when we think about really where this comes from is positioning and asking ourselves, what is the role of arts and culture in urban planning? A lot of the times in the way that I've seen it practiced, it seems that we only limit our thinking of arts and culture as products, right? We want to get to the mural girl. We want to get to the beautification, yet we forget that arts and culture can be incorporated in the planning process just beyond community engagement. There is an art to the way, there is something about the craft of art making that allows us to really think about different approaches to urban planning. The question really is, what is the art of urban planning? Now, I'm not saying that urban planning is an art method, but there's something really fun when you reframe a little bit of the thinking and ask ourselves, what is the art of urban planning? And again, I think for the most part, what continues to happen, and we'll talk about this moving forward, is that we've also given too much of an emphasis on the institutionality of arts and culture and forget the aspect and practice of culture in general, right? In social work practice, we call that cultural humility, cultural competence, or other different ways. But we forget that culture, right? Understanding folks' motivations, understanding folks' aspirations, understanding other folks' metaphors allows us to, it serves as a gateway to further understand the complexities of people. And again, I feel that planners have been trained to overvalue and overemphasize the spatial and physical analysis of place without accounting for the nuances, behavior, and livelihood of the protagonists of place, people. And so the first sort of questions that I've been thinking about are cultural planning is planning, right? So while there has been an interest to incorporate arts and cultures within urban planning, arts and culture continuously remains at the margins of pedagogies included in planning. Due to the fact that urban planning has adopted a more scientific approach to the analysis of cities, there has been little interest in fully integrating arts and culture as a practice of urban planning, which speaks to a greater problem within the field. Urban planners, we will not be able to arrive to cities where all its inhabitants feel like they belong unless we're able to understand communities' motivations, aspirations, social contracts, and other intangible elements to the built environment that cannot be found in a master plan, a calendar screen, or even your cutest map. The current practice of cultural planning is led by cultural agencies in efforts to secure funding or promote policies that limit art to an economic generator as opposed to a people-centered approach. Urban planning is also cultural production. Within the change of space comes a change in images, metaphors, and meaning. I move on now to the second sort of theme of arts and culture and knowledge generation. The most commonly used analysis of arts and culture is limited to the economic and regenerative impacts of a new piece of public art. While there is validity to the roles of arts and culture in the realm of job generation and economic growth, there is also another realm in which arts and culture can be utilized, the realm of knowledge generation. An integration of arts and cultural strategy is more than just integrating institutions or other cultural organizations in a planning process. It is an integration of community knowledge, survival, and lived experience. By highlighting these undervalued forms of knowledge, we invite world building, ancestral knowledge, and radical imagination, which is again a way to openly work in defiance with processes whose main goal has been erasure, right? Isn't that what planning is? Basically, erasure of land, erasure of people, erasure of culture. Yo, I'm like, I want to see what APA thinks about all the shit we're going to be saying today. Listen, just critiquing. Um, for sure. And the last thing I'll leave you with is a quote from Cultural Strategy and Transformative Research, which is a chapter that, again, I had the honor to co-author with Evan, who is here today, which is also a resource that we just published at the Othering and Belonging Institute. And it says, cultural strategy and transformative research is the intentional decision within your research process to acknowledge, validate, notice, and integrate knowledge, practices, and worldviews that have led to survival, continuity, and thriving in the context of racial capitalism and white supremacy. Integrated, APA is not ready for the combo. Integrating the arts, cultural practice, and vernacular ways of knowing and being, that is the aesthetic, the emotional, the embodied, intuition, traditional knowledge, noticing, listening, and ritual, among others, is a strategic decision to shift power in a research process. With that, I will hand it over to our first speaker for today, Marian. I'm super excited. Marian and I met not too long ago, and the moment that we met and we clicked, it was like, girl, I feel you, I see you. How can we collaborate? And I'm super excited that this was a way to do it. So Marian, thank you for joining us, and I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Richard. I'm just going to speak for a few minutes before I go to my slides. I recognize that what I'm about to say, in essence, has been said many times and by many people already, including many of you who I am honored to know and to be in community with. And I want to mention that I've, asked to speak on my own behalf, and that my views are my own, and they're based on my experiences over the past 9 years working at this intersection in Atlanta. And so everything that Richard just shared sounded not like a dissent, but like a manifesto to me, one that I want to sign on to. So I'm just going to start by saying, what is interesting me, like right now at this moment, what I'm thinking about, and why I'm here. And hello, to all my Atlanta folks who've probably heard me talk about this many times. So I am interested really in making plain the tension between the stated values, I think, of planning and actions. I'm interested in deep generational alchemies and wisdoms, rather than, I think, very technical planning knowledge. I'm interested in failure, trying something different, difficult, or new, and not getting it right. And then I'm interested in not renaming failure as a win or even a lesson learned, and also sharing those failures. Although I do recognize that it's hard to learn or unlearn without trying something new or different and possibly failing at it. I'm interested in fear, particularly the fear of that failure, and then the courage to move through that fear. I'm interested in not confusing procedure for process. I think in the description to this event, we're really thinking about arts and culture not as products, but as a process. And sometimes we can also conflate procedure for process. So not getting those two things confused. And then I'm interested in the people for whom arts and culture and planning are indivisible, because this is, maybe how they entered the planning field, is through arts and culture. Because both are dreaming, as Richard said, world building, manifesting, responding to and shaping change, and knowing and being known. So I'm interested in what I've discussed with other folks as shape shifting, right? Like people who are in arts and culture and in planning and moving back and forth sometimes, trying to integrate it all, who are trying to integrate that understanding and ways of being into whatever role they happen to be in at the moment, and moving with that integrity, even if it means needing to move out of a position, right? Even if it means needing to move out of a specific place. I'm interested in people whose work has led them straight into the crosshairs of planning, whose work is frequently co-opted by planning and by other planners, who are often brought into sanction or legitimize and make a planning process or effort legible, particularly to the members of their own communities. And I'm interested in planners who are creating and nurturing space for others to challenge the ideas, that consensus is paramount, that civility is a precondition to any planning process, and that artists and cultural workers have to color within the lines because the planners are just quote unquote following the rules. And I'm interested in people who are creating the spaces that they needed but never had, and are devising the planning practices that they needed but never themselves experienced. So maybe if we can share my slides, I just wanted to, give a little overview of how I come into this work, and then what I've done, and then where this is heading. So I kind of just flipped the title of this, like, how does planning show up in arts and culture? Next slide. So this is where I'm from. This is how I come into this work. I'm actually trained as a lawyer. I don't come from a specific arts and culture background, and I don't come from a planning background. I've experimented with planning school, but we'll see if I ever get back to it. So this is a place that I live here, and I think, I started off by saying I'm interested in the tension between our stated values, and how that actually shows up and manifests in our built environment. And so this is Buford Highway in suburban Atlanta. I think it probably looks like a lot of places that, you work in or have been to. It's how I got started because this is actually the place in Atlanta where I feel most at home. Predominantly because it's very culturally diverse, and it's rather a unique place in Atlanta. Next slide. And I'm currently the Director of Arts and Culture at Smart Growth America, which also houses Transportation for America. And Buford Highway, where I live, has actually been the poster child and is often cited in our work now at Transportation for America. And it's just embodies, I think, a lot of the things that we work on and that we're focused on. And next slide. And it also happens to be, again, this like immigrant hub and neighborhood, which for me, this disconnect between how it was described, either as this place that is dangerous by design or as this place that is like this international food centric, international mecca of dining. And for me, what was most important was the people. And so when I lived here, I started talking to community members, to small business entrepreneurs. And like I said, this was my entry into the world of planning, into the world of arts and culture, was really through talking to my neighbors, talking to community members, because I did not realize that there was so much that I didn't know about planning. There was so much that I didn't know about governance and policy. And really, this place has been, again, that starting point, that entry point for me into this field. And I believe that, and I know that for many folks, their communities are the entry point into this field. And so to move from this place in which you may be deeply rooted, deeply connected, and wanting to be a part of the future and shaping the future of these places leads you to this field that unfortunately does not, or often fails to actually be a place where you can actually support your community in shaping its own future, and actually hinders community needs and desires from being manifested into a more formal and official process. Next slide. So again, I started telling the stories or sharing the stories of the folks that I was talking to because I really was interested again in sharing the community stories and the voices of folks, and not having them shared for them by food journalists or like people with urbanist dreams about this place. And so interestingly enough, like I was invited to be part of this master planning process for Buford Highway. And this was, again, a completely new practice, new field for me. And, as many of you have probably been hired to do, is hired to be the community engagement person for this urban planning process. Next slide. And one of the first things we did was begin this public art process to create a more, walkable community by stitching together these shopping centers, suburban shopping centers, and strip malls. Next slide. And so this is one mural from that process, and that's from 7 years ago now. So I kind of experienced all of these tropes, urban planning tropes, right? As I was, starting a nonprofit, learning about urban planning, learning about the art typical, what Richard referenced is like, we think of murals and we think of arts and culture as products in the planning process, and not as a mechanism itself for the planning. Next slide. Yeah, more of the same. Parking day. Next slide. And what was most meaningful to me, and this was something that I think was a real failure of that public art process, was that the stories were not really, we did engagement with community groups. The artists were working with the community groups to, learn their stories, share their stories so that the stories could be embodied in the public art. And one real big regret for me was that these stories during that process were not recorded. But we did eventually start an oral history project, which to me is the most meaningful part of my work at We Live Buhai. Next slide. And from there, I moved on to the Atlanta Regional Commission, where I was originally hired for another job. But during the pandemic, I was promoted into being the director of the Community Engagement and the Arts program. So the Atlanta Regional Commission is a regional planning agency and the metropolitan planning organization for the Metro Atlanta region. And it's somewhat unique in that it has an arts and culture program. And when I was promoted into this role, it was me full-time, and then like 2 people working part-time in the team. And so again, as Richard mentioned, this is really focused on engagement. So I was learning as I went deeper into how arts and culture can be a mechanism in the planning process. Next slide. And I think I'm moving too slowly, but so this is some of the lessons learned, right? Some of the policy recommendations that I had for the arts and culture work going forward. Next slide. And now I'm at Smart Growth America working as the Director of Arts and Culture, and we just launched this program. We just started our technical assistance portion of this program, which is on healing our highways. Next slide. And I'll just quickly wrap up. But the goals are to generate creative ideas and activities that build knowledge, connection, and power within disadvantaged communities most harmed by transportation systems and climate change. We're working with artists, culture bearers, culture workers that are deeply rooted in their communities and sharing knowledge around the transportation, land use, and climate processes. Next slide. And so this is where our selection process was really based in these states and the metro areas that are most dangerous for pedestrians. Next slide. And I just want to wrap up because I don't want to take too much time, but definitely centering the community's cultural identity, needs, and power for these. And we're partnering with a team that is bringing on cultural and community organizing to our teams of artists and community activists. Next slide. So this is some amazing artwork from Alfred Tuo that was for this program. Next slide. And I think that's it. Next slide is the pictures of our selected teams. I think some of the people are on this call. So hi, y'all. And that's it. Thank you. I'll pass it back to you, Richard.
Thank you so much for that. I think there were already so many questions. I was taking notes. My favorite one was when agencies co-opt into art practices. But listen, I was like, let me start charging royalties for some of the shit that I did out there. But no, thank you so much. I think a lot of good framing and a lot of good, great intro presentation. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rustin. Also, Rustin is someone that I've recently just met, and it's been so cool, and I think it's happening in the chat, and it's one of my favorite things, at least from the 2 of the seminars that we've done so far, has been the community that is starting to form, where we know other folks. I know folks from, it's funny enough, I saw Fatima, who I've also met before on the slide, so it's just kind of cool to see all of us come together in some ways. So I'll hand it over to Rustin with that.
Awesome. Can people hear me okay? Okay, cool. Great. Hi, everyone. This is such a cool room to be in. I'm really honored to be invited here, so thank you all. I figured maybe it would be helpful to just kind of show a bunch of projects. I love what Marion said to kind of set us up about the kind of the framework of how thinking about how planning connects with power, connects with organizing and community, and how we see ourselves reflected and not reflected in these kinds of processes. But I'm going to show you just a bunch of stuff, and then we'll kind of like maybe get into the whys and the hows a bit more in the conversation. So I'm an artist and designer, somewhere in between that and an organizer. I kind of got into culture out of working in kind of nonprofit housing development and seeing kind of like how narrow the horizon of like what seemed possible was. A lot of my job was about talking to communities about, why they shouldn't fear the development of supportive housing in their neighborhood. And you sort of saw how much the horizon of what was possible or desirable was set by things that were way, way, way prefiguring kind of the political process for understanding what's possible. And so I became interested in this idea of culture as this longer horizon of, how do you use this means that we all participate in to change this framework? It's the only way we have non-coercively to change what people desire, what people want, what people are afraid of, what people think is possible. And so I got really interested in using culture in that way. So I'm someone who now works, I think in a lot of different kinds of medium, from permanent public signage to publications to even just running like a public mediation process about the commemorative or civic landscape, civic memory landscape. All these different kinds of ways of working, but they all have in common just a long-term process, and one that's usually deeply connected with people who are doing organizing work. So I'm just going to show, I think, 3 or 4 projects that I think get at some of the questions that have been laid out. So this first one is a project called Vendor Power, produced with a membership-driven organizing group called the Street Vendor Project and a designer named Candy Chang back when I was at an organization that I co-founded called the Center for Urban Pedagogy. And so essentially that project is a really direct idea of like, how can art and culture and design, specifically in this case, intervene in the space between experts, quote unquote, and non-experts in the kind of like a public space. So here's the kind of the rules about like where vending is prohibited on a particular stretch of Manhattan. And as you can sort of see, even if you were a fluent English speaker with a lot of time on your hands and a law degree, it would still be a lot of time and trouble to figure out like what you could or couldn't do. And this leads to some really specific deficits in what I would call sort of operational transparency. So everyone has equal protection under the law, only some people can know what it is. So it leads to a real power dynamic when someone asks a street vendor to move. So the intervention here is really basic. How do you take this and turn it into, a design that requires, very little language at all, and is translated into multiple languages and can be used like on the street in an interaction with a bricks and mortar store owner or a cop who's telling you you need to move. You can understand, here's my rights, and you can actually present them in this very formal looking document that you know what you're talking about. So basically the IKEA manual of like street regulations. And that folds out into a larger poster that talks about an advocacy framework. And we produced this in edition of 20,000, distributed them partly through the Street Vendor Project's vendor network, sold half of them to an art and design audience, and eventually the Department of Consumer Affairs in New York City decided that this is something that they should have been doing in the first place. And talking about this kind of co-option thing, they're just kind of like, there's lots to talk about there. But essentially they just started printing them themselves, or with our permission, to give out to people who are applying for vendor permits. Should they have paid us? Lots of questions. But that's an idea, I think, of a very simple, direct way that art and design can be an interface. Now, CUP has continued on to make dozens and dozens of these on all kinds of topics, ranging from how to start a co-op to how to navigate the immigration justice system and deal with ICE to juvenile justice and so on and so forth, fracking, you name it. There's a kind of guide, and all uses this model of pairing an artist and a designer with an advocate to produce a poster in this format. In the more kind of distinctly planning mode, this project, this envisioning development toolkit, came out of I guess sort of my personal frustration of going to community board meetings where you would sort of see an entire conversation about a project kind of just devolve into just people kind of shouting about affordable housing with no kind of clear definition of what they were even talking about. Like, who is this affordable to? What are the restrictions around it? How does it relate to the rest of the neighborhood? And it sort of felt like there was this thing where no one really, if people had the tools to speak clearly about it, they weren't using them. And so it's kind of another gambit in this mode of like, if you give people tools, if you give city planning the tools to explain what their project is really clearly, will that change the conversation? So essentially, this project takes the form of a book that uses visual language to describe kind of technical definition of affordable housing. The main part of it is this big felt poster that's used in a meeting where people kind of map out the demographics of their own neighborhood by income using the federal definitions of various income categories. And they can sort of see, what's the population of this neighborhood like? How is it changing? How does that relate to rents? Using the definition of affordable housing as 30% of your income, what does that mean about the housing that's in our neighborhood now? And it sets the table for a whole variety of different kinds of conversations, ranging from gentrification to a specific housing development to the regulations around affordable housing in general, and what are the affordable limits, or for people who are doing organizing within public housing in New York, how does that fit into the affordable housing landscape, and so on and so forth. So it's meant to be this tool that essentially just simplifies language and allows people to have this conversation that is often kind of presented as too technical for a community to engage in. So those are, I think, just two really basic examples that I think answer this question of like, how can art and design kind of connect into that interface of like formal urban planning? I now want to show maybe a few other projects that I guess pull at that in a different way. So there's something I like to think about that's like I call the interpretive layer. It's actually a term I got from Matt Coolidge from the Center for Land Use Interpretation. And in this idea, you have an observer, you have a landscape, and a lot of what you see in a landscape is actually just your own biases and knowledge kind of reflected back to you. So that's what's going on when you go to a neighborhood and you decide that you're seeing a good neighborhood or a bad neighborhood, or you're seeing a place that has blight, or you're seeing a place that is vibrant. These are all things that I think are really derived as much by this kind of like observer as it is anything you're seeing in the landscape. So I'm interested in these projects that kind of work with this interpretive layer that helps interface between when someone's in a place and what they see when they get there. So I'll give a concrete example of that. A few years ago, I was asked to do a project in Willowbrook, which is a small unincorporated part of LA County in between Watts and Compton. And so if you're not from LA, and even if you are from LA, but you're not from that area, you might never heard of Willowbrook, but you almost for sure, no matter, you might be in another country, you've heard of Watts and you've heard of Compton. And what you think you know about Watts and Compton is, really determined by this massive media footprint that is extremely specific to tell you like what these neighborhoods are about. And even within LA, I would argue this kind of media product really, really inflects any sort of conversation about what is happening in these neighborhoods and what they're about, even if they're decades outdated. So I was asked by the county to create what they were calling creative visioning tools, like basically exercises for the community to use to guide future investment that might happen in that neighborhood because of the reopening of a hospital. But when I got to that neighborhood, as many of you have probably already guessed, like, the first meeting was just people saying, like, who are you? Why are you here? And why weren't we invited to this meeting? And there's, zero trust, zero interest in participating in any kind of creative visioning exercise. And there was very, very reasonable reasons for that. This is an example of just like this, a plan from 1969 that starts like this for Watts. It says, let's be honest, the last thing the residents of Watts want to see or read about is another plan for this nationally known community. Plans and studies have a way of wearing thin over the years. And if you read on, like there's no point in this intro where it says like, but this one's gonna be different, or, but no, like we're taking a new tack. It's just another plan. And in fact, literally the year before I was asked to do this, international consulting firm had already produced a pro bono community plan for the neighborhood. So very reasonably, the residents in the neighborhood were like, we don't really want to do any more visioning. We don't want to do any planning. They had planning fatigue, and they'd experienced, decades literally of kind of planning blight. And so the question really became very much a kind of moral and ethical question for me of like, what can I do with these resources that wouldn't be really shameful? And so after a fairly long time of soul searching, we kind of came up with this other approach, kind of flipping that idea of visioning on its head. The idea became, instead of trying to make some tools for the residents to envision some sort of imaginary future, could we make some sort of tools to help people who are not in the neighborhood just see the neighborhood for what it was, which is a really beautiful place. So we produced a home and garden tour, a weekend festival that was food, art, and culture, and then kind of produced a publication coming out of it, just highlighting some of the things that are happening in this place. And it's a place that, because of the zoning, has these really, really deep lots. And so when you just drive through, you really have no idea what's going on in the neighborhood. It's all happening in the backyard. So here's an example of this couple, Sandy and Harry, who he had an exotic tortoise collection, she had an exotic cactus collection, and they got together and kind of built this backyard tortoise cactus paradise. Here's like a fountain created by a self-taught stonemason who made this out of the construction rubble from the 105 freeway. This is a marching band led by Barry White's a ranger. Here's an all-volunteer dog training club run by two retired truck drivers in a vacant lot. Here's this incredible sculptor, Charles Dixon, who has one of the world's largest collections of super soakers, which were invented by a black aerospace engineer from Leimert Park. Here's a registered nurse who has a model train world in her backyard. This guy on the right, he runs a horse and buggy service in the neighborhood for kids going to prom. So all these things that nowhere fit into the kind of, you close your eyes and imagine what you think is going on in Watson Compton if you've never been there. And again, this publication was produced in half of it was given to residents and sold as a fundraiser for the library. The other half is kind of given to people who are working in the county, who are assigned to work in Willowbrook as a kind of alternate briefing. So instead of just looking at the SPA, like the statistics about gun violence or something, you can also see all these other layers of what is happening in this place. And ideally, it kind of breaks open your preconception of what this neighborhood is about and what it's possible there. And in the county supervisor commissioned this, ended up commissioning 5 more of these books that are similar kinds of artist-led windows into other neighborhoods in his district, with the idea of can we kind of use this tool to help orient people and understand these places in a different way. I'll show just a couple of other things quickly. This is a similar kind of idea, and I guess one way I want to talk about culture is that and this is sort of obvious to describe, but I think it's important to say, is that culture is not sort of like something that lays on top of a neighborhood or sits on the side, but in most cases, it really is what a neighborhood is. It's what you're talking about when you're talking about a neighborhood. And culture is not just sort of artists who have artist studios, but all these different kinds of culture bearers and makers and a way of being and a way of seeing the world. And so sometimes the projects I do are just about trying to figure out ways to kind of help reflect that back to the community itself, to build an idea of what they most want to preserve. And this is the case in this project that was commissioned by the Little Tokyo Service Center. Little Tokyo is a neighborhood in Los Angeles, one of the oldest remaining Japantowns in North America. And this project's called Takachizu. Is essentially, Takachizu is like a neologism of Takara, and Chizu is a treasure map. And it's essentially a form of asset mapping. So we opened this exhibition in Little Tokyo with just black pegboard, nothing in it at all. And then over the course of the several months, we ran workshops where people brought in cultural treasures, things that they valued in the neighborhood. And we photographed them with a light table there, printed them out on site, recorded stories, and we had these kind of show and tell sessions where people would talk about what they brought, and we write it up and kind of produce an exhibit kind of as time went on, filling the space, and also just sort of hosting and holding conversations about what was valuable about this neighborhood that is seeing enormous change. It's one of the most kind of threatened neighborhoods in Los Angeles in a sense in terms of the cultural meaning of it. I could go on and on, but just to say that this strategy, the idea of it is to kind of present an idea of what is valuable about a place and then mobilize it. So we took this, the material from this project, and this is a really powerful idea that I got from Little Tokyo Service Center, the organizing that they've been doing in the community with a bunch of other organizations. It's the concept of moral site control. So it's there's a city-owned lot in the neighborhood, and they don't technically, as a developer, have site control, but they wanted to use culture to kind of build the idea that the only moral thing for the city to do would be to give it to Little Tokyo as a way to extend what was there and to tell the story of how that lot was taken during incarceration in the 40s, and all the things that have happened since then, and also to talk about the vitality and the importance of it to the community. And I think this is a really important piece of how culture can mobilize and organize people into real political effect, where the city did in fact end up being able to transfer that site. Obviously, the neighborhood is still under all kinds of threats. It's an ongoing work. It's never done, but there is this way that culture kind of wraps all those things together. One last thing I'll do very quickly. I know I'm kind of like probably at or beyond time. So this is a project I've been working in Skid Row for about a decade. Um, I was first invited into the community by this incredible designer and architect, Teresa Huang, who was doing a community planning process for Skid Row, which was also in the throes of like a major redevelopment plan and rezoning from the city. So if you don't know Skid Row, it's most known as sort of like a place where you can go and see just like enormous amounts of unhoused people. But what people don't really talk about as much is that there actually is also an enormous number of housed people. It's one of the densest concentrations of affordable housing in Los Angeles County. And so it has this really vital role as being an affordable housing stock. And also, there's like a real culture and value to what is happening in Skid Row. There's an incredible vitality there. So, this is not a very radical notion to this crowd, I'm sure, but, to the city, it sort of was, what if you made a community plan in Skid Row with Skid Row residents talking about what they would want to see? And so we produced, a lot of really fantastic ideas that in a lot of different ways have been kind of implemented, from ways of kind of creating safety without police to creating rest stops, places for people to get showers, and stow their stuff, all sorts of ideas that were sort of generated from this process. But of course, as you can imagine, when we produced it and sent this plan over to city planning, they were like, great, thank you. We'll take that into account. There's zero sense that there's any sort of interest on their part in doing it. And obviously a huge part of it was like zoning for affordable housing. And they said just point blank, like, that's illegal. We cannot do that in California anymore. So that's a really great idea, but unfortunately it has nothing to do with our rezoning process. So months later, I was approached by a theater group in the neighborhood called Los Angeles Poverty Department. They're an amazing theater troupe that's been running out of Skid Row for 30 years. And we produced this play, and I made the set for it, and they wrote this kind of incredible, hilarious agitprop thing about sort of developers in bed with politicians, all of which turned out to be totally true, and many of those people are now indicted, etc. But at the time, it was sort of like them just reading between the lines of what they thought was happening. And we produced this kind of like, basically the set was a mini golf course that you could play that sort of told the history of zoning in the neighborhood, and talked about all these sorts of issues. And the thing about the play, and the set wasn't so much, I mean, I think they were great experiences on their own, but they were able to generate like a ton of press and publicity. And, lo and behold, by the time we were done with this process, suddenly the city was able to create an all affordable housing zone. And the goalposts of what they thought was possible, or they told us was like literally impossible, became possible. I think by reaching around sort of to this other way of mobilizing a larger cultural conversation about something that's often considered like a totally technical, boring thing, you could really change the goalposts, I think, of what is possible or doable in planning. And I think that's something I think that only culture can do. You can't really do that through the front door. And culture, I do think of as, central and direct part of organizing. You can't do organizing without having a cultural component. I'm going to stop now, and let other people speak, and then we'll get back into it. But these are the things I wanted to show you, as sort of some approaches.
Thank you so much for that, Rustin. I love the fact that the chat is going off. And definitely, I think as a native Angelino, I will say my biggest the thing that irks me the most is that a lot of the times LA planning is based on an exported image of Los Angeles. And it is because it is planned by people who are not from the city, but alas. I'm down the block from LADOT, so I'm gonna go over there today and agitate some stuff and be like, what's up, y'all? What y'all do on these projects I worked on? To the question that someone asked, right, about how do you follow up? I think it's important. Listen, there are so many questions that I saw in the chat. We're taking note in our notes as well, so we'll send it over to the speakers if we don't get to them. But I also want to get us to the discussion, so I'm gonna turn it over to Evan. Evan, all you, close us out, Evan.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Rostin and Marian, for all of that. I feel like I feel full, so I don't even know. Maybe we should just skip me and go to the discussion would be nice. It's really nice to see so many collaborators and conspirators and colleagues and folks here. So thank you all for being here, and obviously very humbled to be invited to share this space. So Mailana, whenever you're ready to share slides, and thank you, Mailana, for running tech and for keeping us all, getting everybody invited and all of that kind of stuff. So, so my name is Evan. I worked at the Other Near Belonging Institute for about 6 or 7 years where I got to do a lot of arts and culture and planning work. But I'm an artist first, and really kind of backed into planning because I was doing arts-based art organizing around policing, decarceration, abolition work, and education. And that work, everything we were doing kept kind of coming back to these questions of how space is managed and how places are created, right? Like why are there these concentrations of over policing? What's this relationship to structural racism? All these kinds of questions and things. So that's kind of sitting with me as I think about, this question that Richard asked about the benefits and, again, this directionality that I think Marian picked up is like, which direction are we moving from? And how are we giving primacy to something like planning as a professionalized field? So if we can go to the next slide. And I have, I have questions about that, right? Because I think there's this question, and I did go to school for planning and have been doing some of that, and because I wanted to understand it better. And this question of like, what do planners actually do, and what does the planning process do? And so, I think planners really shape the activities and boundaries of spaces. And so what that means is they influence and shape the relations that create places, right? So there's this relationship between shaping spaces, and then that creates the material conditions within places and the relationships within them. And for the history of planning, like for a brief period, there was like a debate between the socialist planners and the capitalist planners, and really the capitalist planners won out because that was already embedded in our Constitution, right? But for the most part, planners have been about servicing private property, protecting value, and also kind of like defense of the state's claim, sovereign claim over land, right, as an erasure of indigenous claims to land. So when we think about planning as a whole, like that's how I think about like what our field is kind of like rooted in, right? So I share this illusion, this fence illusion here, which is an illustration from a little book I made. And I love illusions because they're both real and perceptual, right? Like what are the limits of possibility, and how are we, I think Stuart Hall speaks about that thing that you were talking about, Rostin, about like what is our frame for understanding, right? What is our realm of possibility? And I love illusions because they're constantly playing with that possibility and what we think about, like, there's this balance of material outcomes that we see, the value of one's home, where an oil refinery might be placed, with the illusion or perception of what makes a proper or possible planning process, right? So if we go to the next slide, the question that I like to ask is, what do we want planners to do, and what do we want the planning process to do, right? And I think about this, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore. I come out of kind of abolitionist organizing, and so she's, as a geographer, she's been very influential in my work. And so I think about like her idea that freedom is a place, right? And freedom is a place, which means that we're basically combining our resources, our ingenuity. This is her quote, our quote, combine resources, ingenuity, and commitment to produce the conditions in which life is precious to all, right? So if freedom is this practice of placemaking, as she shares, like what are we doing as planners to create the conditions for practicing or rehearsing placemaking as freedom, right? Her name is Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, or Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Really important geographer and organizer, just really wonderful person. So if we go to the next one, what I like to think about what planners can do is to think about noticing things, right? How do we notice things? How do the things that we notice help us notice what we notice, right? Why do we notice the things we notice? And so I love this quote from Audre Lorde, in Poetry is Not a Luxury, and which is just about the quality of light that we use, right? Which for me is like, what are our techniques? What are our tools for analyzing our lives, right? She says, this quality of light by which we scrutinize our lives has direct bearing upon the product which we live, right? So basically, like, the glasses we put on to look at things change how we understand what we're looking at. And that also changes what we think is possible out of that, right? And so I love it in this poetic sense because it doesn't fall within this kind of like technical jargon of like, oh, well, we're gonna measure the demographics, or we're gonna measure the square footage, or whatever the thing is, right? Like, what's the quality of light by which we wanna think about people and places and how we relate to each other. So if we go to the next slide, and so one of the frameworks. Oh, I'll just let it play. You can go let it play, Marian. My line. Sorry. So those are some of my kids and friends, and you know, I play that because I think of like this idea for me is this framework of insistent humanness, right? Like how do we think about humanness as it kind of like bubbles up and creates cracks in this thing that we keep trying to like keep in a box called planning, right? And how does, you know, I think Marion, you spoke to like fear and failure, and Rossin, you spoke to desire, and like these are conditions of life as humans and as people. And so like how does planning create space for that, right? Why, you know, why do we put that over here? And I think this is one of the things where I think about like the possibilities of not like bringing arts and culture into a planning process, but a planning process that really has that embedded within it. So if we go to the next slide, you know, oh, we get to hear them again. You know, I think about this a lot as an edge zone effort, right? And an edge zone is something that I take from kind of like an ecological concept of where two ecosystems overlap. And some people who know me have heard me talk about this before, but right, the idea that in those spaces of overlap, there's actually a lot more biodiversity. So the image at the bottom is a kind of schematic of two different ecosystems, ecosystem A and ecosystem B, and where they overlap, there's actually a lot more biodiversity, right? There's a lot more creativity, there's a lot more exchange, and hopefully that's what we're creating, or that's what I strive to create through kind of like bringing arts and culture into these processes, but also bringing planning into arts and culture processes, right? And so the above illustration is the Dutch Slaw tidal marsh, which is in East Contra Costa County. It was slated to be housing. Instead, it became a reclaimed marshland, and it's a huge carbon sink in that area, right? In an area that's heavily impacted by refineries and otherwise. So, but what I want to share just briefly today is something that I developed at the Other and Belonging Institute that Richard and I worked on together, which is called the 4 Rs. It's just a framework that I use to kind of organize my thoughts. I use it as a rubric to understand, like, am I doing this enough? How much am I pushing the boundaries? How much am I not? So if we can go to the next slide, I'll just kind of explain. Oh, actually, wait, before we go back, I just want to shout out that this is based on some work by Carolina Balsas and Rachel Morello-Frosch, who wrote a piece about how community-based participatory research impacts science, right? And so I took that idea and then we added and adjusted it and added these to 4 Rs instead of 3. So we can jump into it now. Thanks, Mylana. And I forgot to put a timer on, so if you give me 2 minutes, Mylana or Richard, just let me know. That would be helpful. You can just put up a peace sign or whatever. All right, so the first R is reach. And I think a lot of times when we think about reach, we think about how many people, right? It's about numbers of bodies. But when I think about reach, I think a lot about who is being engaged, right? I think that there's this kind of idea that when we just count the numbers, right, in a planning processes are mandated, community engagement is mandated in a lot of planning processes. There's a simple thing where we just do the numbers, right? But this question of who is engaged in a planning process is a really key part of how we do that. And thinking about the role of arts and culture is a really important thing for thinking about the who, right? So here is a project called Staying Power, which I was part of and facilitated. It was a participatory action research project thinking about housing in Richmond, California. Shout out to all the Richmond folks, Winifred and BK and other folks in the room. Thank you for being here. But this was a project where we basically were thinking about the disconnect between laws that were being passed in the community, how they are being implemented, and how residents understood them, right? So how do we, you know, the city has some policies. How do people know them? How do people access them? How do people think about what their rights are in relationship to that? So we looked at a bunch of different examples, and we got inspired. That's Sunny, who's in the drawing there, that I've worked with for many years. And Sunny and we got inspired by the Know Your Rights murals in Brooklyn that were happening around the times of a lot of the uprisings around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, that were about how do you know your rights when you're filming police, right? And so we said, okay, well, what would the version of that be for a Know Your Rights mural about housing, housing rights in Richmond, right? And so this is a really innovative law, Fair Chance Housing, which prohibits asking for prior conviction status on housing applications in public housing. And then they had also just passed a just cause law. And so this is a mural picturing people in the community who actually did the organizing to get those laws passed. and an analysis of what are the things that we're pushing away, which is the black and white images on the side. And so that was a mural that we created all together. So again, thinking about who gets to participate in these planning processes. So go to the next one. All right, so the second R that I like to think about is resonance. And so when I think about this word of resonance, resonance is when two independent things that are kind of like working together, or they're working independently, when they come together and they're kind of like waves hit together, all of a sudden they start to get like a lot stronger, right? And so how do we amplify and build each other? And so thinking about like what's the alignment between people's lived experiences in the planning process, and how do we check for that? How do we make sure that there is that resonance that's happening for people, right? And so this is another project from this participatory action research project called Staying Power. That it was a book of poems created by a poet in Richmond named Sierra Jabay Gordon that we worked on, a book of poems and photos. And so that's Sierra standing in front of her home that her family lost. It was the family home that she grew up in. And then she created a book of poems basically based on interviews with residents in this area of South Richmond. And this was happening at a time where there was kind of conflicting narratives around why was it Black flight that was happening? Was it Black pushout? Was it displacement? What were the terms of this, right? And so creating these using poetry, using photography, using kind of workshops. That's a workshop using a Monopoly board to talk about histories of redlining and environmental exposure in Richmond. And so this was this project that was trying to bring people's deep personal experiences into a conversation around an analysis of displacement in Richmond. So see, I have 2 minutes. Thank you, Mylana. So we'll go to the next one. I just have 2 more slides, so we should make it. So the third R is rigor. And rigor is about thinking like, what do we include in a research or planning process, right? Like again, this is about who, but it's also about the types of knowledge and experiences that come into that, right? So for example, like if somebody's talking about housing and they're talking about like, social media, or they're talking about role of education, like, traditionally we'd be like, oh, well, that doesn't have anything to do with housing. We don't want to talk about housing, but why? Like, why are people bringing that up when you're talking about housing, right? How do we stay open to that? What are the ways that we bring that into that process? In my experience, like a lot of that stuff comes from using metaphor, using images, using paper sculptures, using exquisite corpse writing to think about what are the insistent, what are these forms of insistent humanism when we think about housing that allow us to think about the entire sphere of experience that might actually create a housing process that actually has more resonance with people's lived experience, right? And that comes through a rigor that allows for this entire process. And so this is an image of a parallel planning process. This is my cute map, Richard, which may or may not include all of those insistently human things, but this is a parallel planning process that we did with an organization called Richmond Land for a large piece of public property called Point Melody, because the kind of city hired group wasn't really engaging people of color or people in central Richmond who were going to be impacted by some of the potential outcomes of this. And then the last one is a shout out to a friend and collaborator, Nate Mullen, who's part of Another World Exists, or AWE, the group that we've recently started. But the first one is the fourth R is regeneration, which is about creating a process and outcome, not a procedure. Thank you, Marion. A process and outcome that is generative, healing, reconnective, and attends to insistent humanness, right? So within our works, I think that there's like, there's the planning blight that you talked about, Rostin. There's civic trauma, which Roberto, who's on this call, talks about, right? Like, how do we not recreate those things through our processes? And so this is a project where Nate, who grew up in Detroit and has, a lot of kind of experiences with safety and transportation planning, was trying to go through all these kind of processes to get a crosswalk to cross a street to a new park that had been created. When none of that was happening, what he started to do was track ginkgo trees in the neighborhood, which are a tree that has a medicinal quality to it, started to map those, and then started to collect all of these ginkgo leaves, and then with his daughter and with a couple other community members would come and lay them across the street to create these kind of ephemeral crosswalks, right? And so it was this way for him to reclaim this public space, to do it as a poetic action in that way, and then begin to document it. And there's a short video there which is has a really lovely kind of a kind of overview of it from him. So I'll stop there. But again, just those 4 R's are reach, resonance, rigor, and regeneration. And that's kind of one of the frameworks that I use for thinking about the benefits, but also as a rubric to think like, how am I doing my work? Do we have regenerative elements in this? Is it rigorous, right? Is it reaching people that aren't usually, that aren't included? And how does it have resonance with myself and also the folks that I'm working with? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan, for that. What I'm going to do right now in the chat, I'm going to add the link to the Discord. So the conversation is going to continue on in the Discord. It's still being built, and I'll send out an email to all of the folks who have registered. Thank you to all of our speakers who dropped some beautiful gems. And wait, one more thing I'm going to add. I'm going to add my email in case people need to drop off. You can contact us, and then if you have any questions. So if folks have any questions, please feel free to start raising your hand. We'll take about 3 questions. The first question, I'm going to ask it because I think it was something that all of you were alluding to, and I think it's the big question overall. This series was created exactly for what was mentioned, this notion that as planners, we have been taught to be observers of the built environment, when what I believe in reality, we are participants in an ecology. Like objectivity doesn't work. Girl, it doesn't work. Like I can't go into a community and not acknowledge that I'm from South Central, that I'm queer, that I'm brown, that I have 2 masters. Like it does not work. And I think this is something that also was brought up by what you said, Marian, right? That a lot of us came into the field through our communities. Like I came into the field because South Central has a bunch of liquor stores and a bunch of hotels. It has the largest concentration of liquor stores and hotels per capita in the city of LA, yet there's 7 Starbucks in a square mile down the block. And we was like, why? And, find out that's urban planning. So my question to you all is, what are those things that we have been taught as urban planners to observe and to somewhat even uplift and amplify? And what is that paradigm shift that needs to happen? And I think some of y'all have been alluding to it, but I'm curious of how there's something that Rustin mentioned about that cultural paradigm shift. And anything, arts and culture is so powerful because we can change perception. And when you change perception, you change reality. And so this notion of, again, what are the things that we have been taught to observe in a traditional planning process? And what are the things that we need to be shifting towards? And that question's to all of you all. And if y'all have questions, raise your hands, y'all.
I mean, I can jump in with some thoughts just so that we don't have too much silence. but I don't want to overspeak either. I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is, and I'll say first of all, I've never been to planning school, so I don't, this is secondhand by observing planners what I think planners have been taught. but my sense is, the profession, and I'm sure it has changed since I got into this world 20 plus years ago, but I think there is a real sense that there is that it's a discipline and has expertise, and people feel like, well, I've gone to school, I know what the best layout for a street is, I know what works for transportation, and my job is to kind of convince people that that's the right solution and make it happen. And I think that just obviously, like me coming from more of an organizing perspective, the idea of how you build a shared analysis together is so central, where it's like you would never start with the analysis and just be like, our whole goal is just to kind of get everyone to like sign on to our analysis, so there's just a really different orientation in terms of like how you're thinking about a democratic process and what participation means and what it is. So in my sense, like and again, like I don't mean to speak about what planning school is like now. I have literally no idea, but but my sense, based on interacting with planners, that feels like a place where it could use a lot of reorientation.
I'll chime in. I'm also didn't go to planning school, so I can't speak for that. But I think one thing is just, and I think Evan referred to this, is it's a professionalized practice. It's a systematized practice. And I think the rigidity in adhering to, I mentioned the difference between process and procedure. And I think that there is a rigidity in adhering to procedure and describing that as process, right? I think there's just that like inflexibility and reliance on the procedure to get you to what you think the community wants, right? And then just, well, we went through 3 public meetings, we had a survey, we had you know what I mean? And therefore that is what the community wants. And that rigidity, I think everyone on this call has moved beyond that, but I think, if you're not on this call, you're probably relying on that to be right, the truth. So yeah, I'll just say that.
Yeah, and I think the place where procedure actually comes up for me really interesting is like as planners, as people in those spaces, like how, like, because I think even though Marion, like we're aligned on this call for some of those things, it's like when it comes down to like how we actually are supposed to do our process, our procedures as planners or people who work in government or whatever it is, it's like, well, shoot, I'm feeling constrained and I can't actually do something, right? So how do we shift that, right? Like, what is the line item in the budget that all of a sudden you start to add in there that changes how people are doing their work, right? And so like those are the places where as planners, I think we have to be really thoughtful about like where actually within those things can we make adjustments that allow us to think about our value system, right? And so for me, the shift is like, what is the rubric or what is the assessment that we're doing around how our values are living in those mundane practices, right? Like those are the things that planners do. Like we get to say we're technocrats, right? We get to say we actually don't have power within these systems because we are implementing procedures. But there's actually a lot of power in that because those are the things that get replicated by people who don't have to be, like in the front of things. So where in those spaces do we actually have wiggle room? And I think that takes like the double analysis of poetry, or it takes the imagination of saying like, well, what, like whatever it is, right? And so, yeah, so I think that's kind of where I think about those, like, how do we do that as individuals, even if we're aligned, like what are the mundane things that we actually shift that allows for those, goalpost moves that Rostin was talking about.
100%. I think sometimes one of the things that I wrote down is that the best planning actually involves chaos. Like allowing for some organized chaos and not shying away from conflict, or rather, how do we think of conflict that's regenerative as opposed to destructive, right? And so bringing in the restorative justice practice. I think a lot of it tends what we all have mentioned is that it narrows down, and I see Gwen and Laura, so I'm going to get your questions after this thought. And so what I hear is that a lot of it is also, it narrows down to the individual, right? And hopefully, I don't know what the goal is maybe with the series. If there's enough of us as individuals, clearly there needs to be a change in the practice. And asking for that and demanding for that, I think it's what's exciting. Maybe that's the next iteration of this conversation, right? Of like, how do we come together and like put something out there, a manifesto, so as Marion called it. Gwen, I want to take your question, and Laura will take yours, and then we'll take those 2 questions and then try to get to it to answer them.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gwen Black. I'm an artist based in New York City. I've been doing cultural planning programming for many years. I'm new to understanding the planning process, but it's something I feel in my heart that we need to do more of in the community. Like recently, I was a part of Art Bridge. If anyone's familiar, and my artwork was selected to be on a mural that was on the scaffolding at the Taft Housing on the East Side. But I feel there needs to be more projects that will enable the artists to come in and the community to come in together to do projects that will uplift the community. Is there any kind of movement happening that's helping that happen? Like Art Bridge here in New York. Is there anything happening that's coming together with the planners? And I'm assuming these are city planners, if I'm correct. What is being done to increase those opportunities for the arts community to work with planners, I guess is really what I'm saying.
Thank you so much, Gwen, for your question. So again, the question was thinking about, have there been iterations or models of artists and planners working together outside of the few of us who are artists and planners? Laura, I'll take over your question and then we'll get to some of those answers.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Gwendolyn. It's kind of on the same vein of what I was curious about. Like I'm relatively new. I mean, I'm an artist and a consultant with the city of San Antonio here in Texas, which has a whole slew of like challenges, right? Like, I mean, I've heard that there's been emails circulate or copies of my email like circulating amongst departments where I'm just like, well, you know, why are you asking Indigenous like artists to volunteer for feedback sessions on how like this urban, like, you know, Indigenous like urban farm is going to, you know, be designed or how it's going to work, but there's no budget to bring us in as consultants, but you want us to come to this session where you're going to pick our brain, you know, and there's no childcare, you know, so it's just like those kinds of challenges in the South, I think are very like intentional, you know, and especially like, you know, like one of the things that we notice here in San Antonio is that, you know, they'll do, you know, this whole thing where they're like, oh, well, we asked community, you know, and like, this is what, you know, they didn't show up or whatever, you know, but then they're also making the meetings like hella inaccessible for working class folk, right? So like people that, you know, would benefit from these public spaces or would have input and like creative insight into a shared space are not included in the conversation, and the stakeholders are already determined and we know it, you know, like we know that Valero's behind it and you know that they're just, you know, putting like their slap on it and like, oh, this is a kid's like, you know, whatever, you know, yet they're funding genocide, you know, on a freaking larger scale, you know. So I mean, I'm just wondering like especially from folks in the South, like that like, you know, have those experiences and those kinds of obstacles to face and like their institutional like barriers around like even getting in the door as a contractor or as because I mean I feel like all the art that gets put up around town is with the same like artists and it's like legacy artists who are like the children or like the people that are connected to like this really problematic like artist Noriega, who was on the campaign for George Bush's like Latinizing the vote, you know. So it's just like him and his like rich friends get access to all the public art, you know. So I just don't I mean I'm like how do you recommend or what are some places that we can look for how to push back against that institutional, like intentional, like urban planning that is not making space for like, you know, for I guess, you know, public sufficiency.
Thank you. Great. Yeah. Thank you.
Who would like to go first?
Sorry, I know that was like a hella loaded question.
No, there's so many pieces to it. Yeah, I mean, I guess, well, one thing I'll just share is that I think that there's broadly a perception of what artists do and who artists are. And I think that within this kind of paradigm shift that we're talking about is that there's actually like a much more expansive practice that we bring as artists and creative people that are supportive of, again, of this idea of like insistent humanness, right? Like, why do our systems not attend to people, right? Like, why do they not care for people? And I think the noticings that artists bring, the practices that we have, the methods that we employ, oftentimes are about that, right? And so like, you know, I'm involved in a program right now in the city of Oakland called the Cultural Strategists in Government program, where we're pairing what we call cultural strategists, not artists, with city departments and elected officials to think about how they can be thought partners not necessarily producers of goods. Oftentimes they end up creating things because we're, you know, restless. But like, how do you work as a thought partner with the transportation agency, right? Like, how do you work as a thought partner with the mayor's office? Not necessarily to kind of like, yeah, to make a poem that does the thing, but there's all of this other kinds of shifts that are happening. And so part of that is like thinking about as artists also, like, how do we value our work, and how do we also talk about the value of our work and think about that, right? And so this is not totally an answer to that question, but I think that there's like some of those shifts in terms of like where we actually see ourselves, and you know, whether we're shapeshifters or trespassers, like how do we know what our kind of like superhero powers are that allow us to do that and access that shapeshifting. And not even shapeshifting, just the self within these different spaces as we move through different spaces, because I don't think we need to shapeshift necessarily.
I can jump in, Marion, though. Do you want to say anything before I say anything?
Yeah, sure. And then you can hopefully contradict it. I think we need more, I think Richard mentioned, right? Like we need more of us. We need more of us who are in positions that can open up new opportunities. I had the opportunity when I was at the Atlanta Regional Commission to transform an existing program. So like what is the material that you already have that you can shift into a whole different a realm, right? Like, so we did have a arts and culture leadership program that was really meant towards, you know, exactly those people you mentioned, as the people who are already connected, the people at the large, well-funded cultural institution, arts and culture institutions in Atlanta. It was really for them to connect and to make the economic case to elected officials for arts and culture investment. And I took that program and I shifted it so that it was really more for artists, more for cultural bearers, to learn about the planning process, right? There's still limitations because it's still housed within a regional agency. So depending on what the regional agency was comfortable saying, right? Like the planning that they were exposed to was still, you know, within a government agency. So, but still there was that more exposure to the process, more exposure to the like, the inner workings of a planning agency, so that, and now Rostin is working on the next iteration of that. So that's amazing. Yeah, so I think who are the people who can, once you're in the door, can find, right? Like, so me, like I was always running into walls, but there are people who can run into walls and find the secret trapdoors, right? And find the ways of moving within those places that actually open up new opportunities for artists.
I'll jump in, I guess. I agree with what you're saying, Marion, about finding like those people who care and like can open up a door. For sure, that's true. I also feel like in this like larger context, I just want to kind of name, you know, I think that it's, and this has already been named, but I think to underscore it, like there is, you know, a huge apparatus for public participation in planning, and that's there because of legally mandated things, because of things that happened in the 60s, because of organizing that kind of pushed that to become part of the formal mechanism of planning and create these like formal entry points to get public input. Of course, those things are like a total sham, and everyone knows it, right? And you know, and I think, but I'm interested in this idea, sort of like a Martin Luther King, you know, from that speech, just, you know, cashing the check of democracy. Like, how do you cash the check of public participation? Like, it's not going to just happen on its own. It's only through organizing that people will actually make any of those avenues real in any sense. And so I think that, you know, people are very right to be skeptical of those kind of formal invitations to participate, but they are openings, you know. And so I think there's this thing of like, can you figure out a way to do this larger strategy to put pressure on those existing kind of cracks and then move things forward? I think it all has to kind of happen in this way that is never going to come from the top down, because like a state authority created like a really great public participation program and then it just worked and the right people came and participated and the right outcome, you know, like that's never going to happen. So it's, you know, if it's something you care about, you know, you've got to organize with your community outside of any sort of like official planning body. It's, so I think that there's just that piece of, which is in my mind partly cultural work. That's what keeps people invested in a community, is like having this kind of rich culture that they're participating and being part of. And so I think there is all this there's a lot of planning that happens beyond planners and beyond like anything that's like the formal planning body that, is really where I think most of like the real change is going to start. And then, there's ways to kind of then flow that through all these other kind of like the discipline of planning. But it's not going to start there, and not to say, obviously, you know, a lot of the organizing is also funded by foundations, and that's like a whole other thing of like who's pulling the strings on that, like, so it's like there's no like pure way, but it's like there's just these opportunities that are there, and how do you kind of figure out how to work with what is there to kind of bring about, and enlarge what is possible. And there's not like there's no one way to do it, but it's a ton of fucking work.
Well, thank you all so much. For the sake of time, I think that's all the time we have for questions. I want to be mindful of people's time because we're almost done. What we'll do moving forward, we'll follow up. If folks want to send over the questions, we'll send the questions to the participants. Milana has been doing a great job at arranging the questions for each of you all. If y'all have time and want to answer them, we'll ask the presenters if they want to share their slides, and we'll share it over to the rest of the folks. I've shared again the Discord link. This is what we'll be engaging during the off time. I'm like, I swear this became a whole ass course. I was like, man, I should have opened my mouth and had an idea, because now I got to do the work. But our next session is on June 3rd, and the next session is going to be so much fun. It is called Embodiment in Urban Planning. A lot of the things that we've been talking about have to do with the mind and have to do with people, but we forget that the body is also important. We'll be talking about the technologies that exist within the body that allow us to talk about spatial relationships. Those are called proprioceptors. It's called spatial navigation. And we'll talk about how do we incorporate body and community engagement processes. So the big question is, how do we talk about gentrification? And rather than talking about gentrification, how do we make people feel gentrification? So make sure you join our next session. The session after that is called Advocacy in Urban Planning. So it is, the big question for that is, when do we hold the urban planner accountable? So that's coming up in July. Again, I'm really excited. I'm telling you, I was like, I just want to talk shit and I want to make this my job. Luckily, at the Other and Belonging Institute, we talk about belonging in another read, and so I just have to, make sure I don't other anyone by talking shit. But I'm like, I'm gonna talk shit about the institution. That's the one othering I'm okay with. Well, thank you all for joining us again, to the 300 plus of y'all who joined us today. So much gratefulness to all of the speakers. Thank you for coming, and we'll be sending out more information to come. Bye, everyone.